Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to Drew the Catholic. I'm Drew the Catholic.
I'm Stephen, not the Catholic.
He's just Stephen. Thanks for joining us for another podcast. As you probably gathered from the title, we're kind of continuing our journey in discussing the Jewish roots of the Bible, specifically the Jewish roots of authority. So last time we had talked about the Jewish roots of what I would call the magisterium, and then how you find that in the Old Testament, that the Jews had the written word, they had an oral tradition, and then they had a living office or groups of offices that made judgments based on those two. And then I argued that in the New Testament we find the same thing, which lo and behold, the Catholic Church has.
Yes.
That's kind of what we talked about last time. But we left off a couple of our notes of things we wanted to go through, and there's some things that you really wanted to bring up.
Yeah, there was a few things that I wanted to bring up. I figured at the tail end probably wasn't the best time because it was something a little deeper to go into. These are
full
questions.
episode worthy.
Yeah, and these are questions I feel like a lot of people have.
Okay.
There are questions I have about things. I kind of want to go because we're in authority, so I kind of want to go into the papacy, talk about how we get to the Pope for the Catholics, kind of like what Bible verses that you would go to show like the Catholic, like this is why we believe this, and then maybe go outside of the Bible and show stuff. And then I also wanted to do some kind of pushback on it and also talk Orthodox.
About the Orthodox Church. Okay.
Yes, because from my understanding, they don't have the Pope, but they do have priests.
Right. They have priests and bishops.
They just don't follow the Pope.
They don't submit to the authority of the Pope.
So yeah, so I kind of wanted to, that was kind of like a pushback on the whole Pope, so I kind of wanted to talk about that.
Sure. Okay. Cool. Yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about the Pope, the Jewish roots of the papacy.
Yes.
Brant Petrie has a really good lecture on this that I'm not even going to come close to. But yeah, there's some things for sure I think to talk about there. So.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, so kind of give a story of, for me, been studying, listening to you, listening to other people, and came across a few verses. And I've been doing this lately. There's a lot of verses. I'm just like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah, that's in the Bible?
That's in the Bible?
Wait, that shouldn't be in the Bible. We got to take that out.
No.
And cut out the Book of James.
And then, and then I'm like, we should have thrown out this. But like, and then like doing my own study and research on it and kind of seeing what certain people have said, what this actually means is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, so I figured we'll start there because that's kind of my journey is, I guess we'll just get to, it's Matthew 16.
Ah, yeah. Classic.
And so for me, I was like, there's so much in the Bible when you actually start to read the Bible.
You're like, huh?
And I'm like, why do we not
Didn't know that was in there.
Why don't we talk about this at church? So
well, we do.
Well, you do.
I do.
I don't know. Maybe we do. We just gloss over. I know for a fact we don't talk about the second verse.
Yeah, that's true. When I was Protestant, the second verse I never heard.
The first verse, I know we do, but I feel like, and maybe I'll even show you where I feel like we break it down.
Sure. Okay.
So, and kind of the way of, and you would know this, you were Protestant at one point, so you would kind of know what they've interpreted it to.
Yeah.
But I guess I'll read Matthew 16.
Okay.
Just so we can get an idea of what I'm talking about.
Sure.
And here we go. It's Matthew 16, 15 through 19. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
The word of the Lord.
The word of
Thanks
the Lord.
Be to God. Yeah, that's a good passage.
Yeah, so when I read that, I was like,
it sounds like someone's been given some keys. What do we do with the keys?
Wait a minute. And yeah, I know everyone's like, it just blew me away.
Yeah, so you read this plainly, and what did you come away with?
So when I read that, I went, is there a Pope?
Uh-oh.
Is this real?
You wake up and find, oh no, there's a Pope.
I was like, wait, who? Because this made me just be like, who, where did the, okay, what is this? First off, what does this even mean? Because, if I'm reading this, I'm like, well, that kind of means he didn't say to anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
he was
just
very
to Peter.
specific to say this just to Peter.
Right.
And I'm like, well, okay, so if he does this to Peter, who now has that?
Right.
Does that just die off? Did, like, why did he say this?
Right.
And so that kind of sent me down this little, like, wait a minute. And, like, I've wanted to talk to so many people about it. I'm like, what do you think this means? And like, kind of going through and listening to certain, I don't know what their denomination are, but like Protestant versions, they're like, well, he doesn't actually say Peter is rock. He's actually saying Jesus is the rock, and that's the church. And I'm like, but that's not what it says.
Yeah, it says you are Peter, which
like,
means rock.
Yeah, and their argument is like, well, it's not actually rock because like Petro and Petros and all this little stuff. And I'm like, but
oh man, there's so much to talk about.
There's so much, and I'm like, but no.
Let's do this. Let's be good Bible church people. Okay. I'm gonna walk through this exegetically, like I'm preaching at a Bible chapel or something. So I went to Bible churches that were like exegetical, da 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 da. Let me walk through this. Let's get some context that doesn't necessarily dive into that part yet, and then let's dive in there because there's a lot of stuff about the Petros. What's he talking about? And then ultimately, the other passage that this links to.
Yeah, and that's actually. And I'll bring that one.
You'll
up
bring
when
that
we
one
get
up.
there.
Okay. So I want to go to the full passage, and so I'm going to pull up Matthew 16, and so the disciples in this passage, just for context, they're not in Jerusalem. Okay, they're in Caesarea Philippi. So it starts. This passage starts in verse 13. So let me go there. So Matthew 16, beginning in verse 13, and I'm reading. By the way, I'm reading the NIV. So this is the this is like a Protestant
the one they
version.
go to.
Yeah, I'm not reading an RSV. I'm not reading a Catholic.
Mine
Bible.
was NRSV.
Okay. Yeah. So wow, good job. I'm reading NIV, and so I'm just gonna do that just because it was the first one that popped up, honestly. But so Matthew 16:13, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, which, by the way, Caesarea Philippi is not like a Jewish city. There are Jews there, but Caesarea Philippi is like a very Greco-Roman city. A lot of Roman culture, a lot of paganism. So that's important to know. So they come there, and Jesus asks his disciples. He says to his disciples, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" Verse 14. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples that not to tell anyone he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day and raised to life. And then that's when Peter says, "Never," and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." So this is all kind of one chunk. I think the first thing I want to talk about is where they are. So they're in Caesarea Philippi. Now, again, not a Jewish city, not a lot of Jewish culture here. They're in a very Roman, Hellenistic, pagan place. And in Caesarea Philippi, there was a temple to the god of Pan. And Pan was one of the gods associated with Hades, the underworld. So there's this...
Pan is the little...
That's the goat.
The goat with the flute.
With the flute, yeah. So there's this association with this temple to the underworld in Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi, where they even called it like the gate of Hades, supposedly. Steve Ray has a great sermon on this. Steve Ray is a Baptist convert to Catholicism. And Caesarea Philippi, this temple to Hades, some supposedly even called the gate to Hades. So that's where they are when he's saying this, the gates of Hades. They're literally in front of what the pagan world thinks might be the actual gates to hell, right? And that's just really neat because that's just Jesus's creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's literally saying the most pagan temples, the most pagan nations will not overcome what I'm about to create. So I think that. I just want to add that because that just, I think, adds depth to this story. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is Peter's name.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the passage first calls him Simon Peter. So they're in Caesarea Philippi. Verse 16, Simon Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." Verse 17, Jesus responds and says, "Simon, son of Jonah, you didn't do this. My Father gave you. And I tell you that you are Peter."
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, why is that important? Because is his name just Simon Peter? That's what it said. But Jesus said Simon Bar-Jonah, and then he called him Peter. Well, what gives? The first time that Jesus meets Peter is in terms of what we have recorded, is in John 1. So in John chapter 1, beginning in verse 35, basically a lot of John the Baptist's disciples meet Jesus and start to follow him. And in verse 40, Andrew's been following him, and that's Peter's brother. In verse 40 of John chapter 1, it says this: Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. So, okay, there again, Simon Peter. Isn't that his name?
Mm-hmm.
Simon Peter was one of the two who heard what John said and followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. So that John says that, which when translated is Peter. Okay. Mm-hmm. Peter's name was not Peter. It was Simon. Simon Bar-Jonah, because that's your last name comes from your dad's name, Simon, son of Jonah. Mm-hmm. So Peter gets renamed by Jesus.
God doesn't just change names willy-nilly.
No. Whenever God changes someone's name, he's redefining their identity and giving them an important role. So let's think about Abraham. God renames Abram, which we talked about this last episode, yes, which means father of glory. He renames him Abraham, which means father of many nations. And then what does he say? I'm going to make you a father of many nations. Mm-hmm. God gives him a new identity, a new name, and a specific appointment to a specific role. Okay, Jacob gets renamed. He wrestles with God, and he gets named to Israel, those who wrestle with God. He becomes the patriarchal head, and his children become the 12 tribes. Abraham's children didn't become tribes. It was just Isaac. Isaac's children, Esau and Jacob, didn't become the tribes. Jacob became Israel, those who wrestle with God. His children became the tribes. So in that sense, he was the head of Israel. The tribes come from his loins. Mm-hmm. So God renames him and gives him a purpose and a new identity and an appointment with that. Mm-hmm. Okay? So when you see Jesus, who is also God, by the way, renaming someone whose name is Simon to Cephas, that's important. We should take note of that. Mm-hmm. What's happening here? Here's what's interesting. John captures this perfectly because John is writing to a Greek audience in terms of how he uses philosophy and all that stuff. But he uses Peter's Aramaic name, Cephas. Mm-hmm. Simon Bar-Jonah, you're called Cephas. St. Paul in his letters refers to him as Cephas as well. So we know that the Aramaic word for Cephas is the Aramaic word for rock, and that's not a gendered language. Cephas, it's really Kepha in the Aramaic. That means rock. And there is no Kepha or Kephos. There's just the word Kepha. Mm-hmm. Okay. The other thing we know culturally is that Jews spoke Aramaic as their dialect of choice. They knew Hebrew for their religious worship. They knew Greek to live in that world, but they spoke Aramaic day to day. Now, you can't prove from Matthew 16 that they would have been speaking Aramaic and it was translated into Greek. But if we can just assume, we can all in good faith assume that they were probably using Aramaic and Greek interchangeably. Kepha does not have a delineation between gendering language that could make it mean something different. The context is what gives it the meaning. Mm-hmm. So that brings us back to Matthew 16, because what a lot of people will say, and what I was taught is that the word for Peter and the word for rock are different. Mm-hmm. This is technically true. So if we went to Blue Letter Bible, I'll go there right now. And Blue Letter Bible is a site where you can look at Greek concordances alongside the Bible, and you can see what the words say and what they mean. Now, this isn't saying that you don't have to know Greek, because just because you can look at the dictionary definition of a word doesn't mean that you're understanding the full context of it.
Yeah.
But let's just go to Matthew 16, because they are correct in saying this. In Matthew 16, he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock." They are correct in saying that they're technically like written on the page differently. So Peter is Petros, and so that's Petros if you anglicized it. And rock is Petra, Petra. Mm-hmm. Now, the important thing, if you click on it, so if you go, and I'm on Blue Letter Bible, if you click on Petros, it's a primary word, and then Petra that's the same root word. Okay, so they're talking about the same things, and it comes from Petros. Okay, now Protestants will try to tell you that Petra means rock and Petros means pebble, which is interesting.
You are the pebble that I will build my church on.
Right, because he's trying to say that you are a pebble, you're nothing, but this rock, which is your confession, is what I'll build my church on. And that's the interpretation I was taught, is that the rock isn't Peter, it's his confession of Jesus. So anyone who confesses Jesus is Lord is on the rock.
But that doesn't even make sense, because like you still have to change.
Huh?
Like,
here's the best part: Blue Letter Bible, Petros doesn't even say pebble.
Oh, what is this?
It just says rock or stone.
Oh,
and then Petra says cliff, rock, or stone. So then, okay, what's going on here? Because I was taught this in church, that Petra was stone and Petros was pebble, and Jesus was using a play on words, saying you're just a little pebble, but this thing that you found is a rock.
Isn't there something about, where were they at again?
Caesarea Philippi.
Isn't there something about that place? I can't say that, so I'm not even going to try.
The temple.
Well, there was
built into like a cliff or a.
Yeah, it was built upon a rock.
Yep.
So not only was he in front of where they said the gates of Hades,
but it was a rock.
But they were also literally looking at something built on.
And Jesus
rock.
is building a rock not in a cliff, but on Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. Yeah. The other thing about the pebble thing is so we have to explain why Petra and Petros are different. Okay. You know Spanish at all?
Nope.
Okay, but you know how in Spanish there's like los and las. It's a gendered language. Yeah. Like diablos is like devils, but it's los, so it's a masculine word.
Okay.
I'm trying to think, like gatos is masculine. There are words that are masculine and feminine built into that language. It's a feature of that language. Okay, well, so Petra is a feminine word. So Peter is a man. So is Jesus going to name him a girl's word?
No.
Or is he going to masculinize it when he names it?
Well, God likes to make things very feminine, if I got that correct. So
Right. So no, like Jesus couldn't call Peter Petra, because then they'd be like, wait, is he a girl? And no, he's a man. So the thing to understand is that there's a gendered thing in Greek. So Petros would be more properly ascribed to Peter as a title, because he's a man, and it's a masculinized version of Petra. Petra is feminine. So you wouldn't say Peter, you wouldn't say Simon Petra, you'd say Simon Petros, because he's a man.
Like, but even like just to go to like, oh, well, his name is Pebble. Mm-hmm. His name is Pebble.
Mm-hmm. Well,
why would he name him Pebble?
Right, and some people will say, well, he named Peter Rock because he's stubborn. Well, sure, but his name could have multiple meanings.
No, but I mean, you can say that, but when did God ever change someone's name to fit the mood of who they were?
Right, and not give them an identity.
That's
my point that I like to make, is God doesn't just rename people as like cute nicknames.
Well, like Pebble. I'm sorry.
Right.
Like, I have to go back to that.
See, like, you got a pebble in your shoe?
But what would be the significance of Pebble?
Right.
Like, even if you try to argue their point.
In
like,
Aramaic, there's no gendered, and it means rock. Yeah, so Kepha, Cephas, just means rock. Mm-hmm. Right. So that kind of takes that argument out of the game.
Yeah.
So now we have, let's just say that everyone agrees Kepha means rock, and whether he was called Petros or Kepha, it means rock. By the way, most Protestant scholars are now starting to agree with the fact that Peter is the rock here.
Okay.
That's changing.
Well,
that used to not be the case. Now it's changing.
Well, it's very like, I don't know how do you not look at it and think that's very specific to one person? It's not like, did he go like, and maybe this is where I'm ignorant, is like, did he go around and change every disciple's name?
No.
So again, Jesus doesn't do anything in the Bible that's not significant.
Right. Well, so some people,
every little thing has significance.
I agree. Some people, and even Orthodox scholars, will point out that there were early church fathers who did interpret the rock as his confession, like St. Augustine, Origen, and a few others.
Okay.
What's important to know, though, is those same church fathers, for the most part, in other places also ascribed Peter as the rock. So it was both and.
Okay.
So in the early church, that was okay. It could mean multiple things, and they didn't have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that's important to point out, because that kind of gets to your other point. The Protestant will say, well, it means pebble. The Orthodox typically will say, well, the church fathers interpreted it that his confession was the rock, so it's not Peter. Origen said both, I believe.
Okay.
I'd have to find the source for them. But there was a lot of church fathers who believed both.
Mm-hmm.
It could mean both things. Like Scripture could have multiple meanings. But in terms of what we're seeing very plainly here, Jesus, who named him Cephas, is saying that he is a Cephas, and on a Cephas, that's the Aramaic word, on a Petra, this will be built. Yeah. This church, this ecclesia, this assembly will be built. Okay. I don't know how you can get away from that being a claim to a unique authority. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how you can read it without trying to, like, for me, once I started to just read it plainly, I'm like, how can you read this plainly without trying to twist the words or come up with a weird way around it and read it any other way?
Yeah. Well, so then I was reading it and I'm like, okay, maybe God, maybe Jesus is just establishing, like, I'm leaving soon. Someone needs to start the church, and then from there,
it becomes potlucks.
And like, and to be honest, like, okay, but maybe that did happen. Who knows? So, but like when I was reading that, I'm like, maybe this is just him saying, you will start the church. Like, as to come in a Protestant view, maybe someone else needed to start the church because Jesus is gone. Like, because Jesus didn't start. I mean, this is me saying it. Did Jesus start the church? Technically, yes.
Technically, yes.
But in a sense of,
but
like a building
in
and a place.
Sure.
No.
I see what you mean. He did,
like,
the
someone
apostles
needed to
took
go
over
and,
at some point.
Yeah,
right.
Someone else needed to go.
Okay.
Actually, like he started foundation. Someone else went in.
One might say he's the cornerstone.
Cornerstone.
The Bible
the
says
first
that.
brick.
Yeah. The Bible says he's the cornerstone.
cornerstone.
That's like the foundation stone.
Yeah.
Of
no, I'm just saying, like, I didn't mean he didn't start it. I'm just saying.
No, I know
like,
what you mean.
Yeah, like he didn't actually go out and put these things. Like
he only really taught like 12 people.
Yeah, and then which was the point of these 12 people. You go out and do all this,
right?
Because he says, do that, right? But so I was just thinking, okay, maybe that's what it means. Is
sure.
And then somehow stumbled across this verse.
I know where you're going.
Yeah, and because I was like, yeah, maybe maybe we don't need a pope, and they're wrong, and there's nothing that would actually show. Okay, he's given him kind of an authority, but maybe it's just to be a teacher and go start this church. And then, Isaiah is a great place to go find things that show us that Jesus is the Messiah. Mm-hmm. Well, might also show some other things that we seem to want to ignore, because
this is Stephen the Catholic.
This is this is what kind of frustrated me. Is like, why have I never heard this verse? Mm-hmm. Like, if we want to go through, we could go. I've gone to church 7 years now, and not once. And I went regularly, listened to multiple sermons. Not once did I ever hear this.
Right. I was Protestant my entire life. I never heard Isaiah 22 preached on. Right. Mm-hmm. It's not like a particularly sexy passage, apart from the way you're about to read it.
Yeah.
So it's not like they'd be like, oh, let's read Isaiah 22 because it has a bearing on our life. But I get what you're saying. It's like someone might read this and go, interesting. That'd be convenient to avoid.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying there's a parallel, but I'm saying it might be the same verse.
Okay, read it. Read it.
I'm going to read this.
Is this also from the NRSV?
This is also from
so
the
you read
NRSV.
both from the
yeah,
NRSV.
so they will be as close together as they can be. Okay, so this is Isaiah 22:20 through 22. On that day, I will call my servant Eliakim, thank you, son of
Hilkiah.
Maybe you should read this. Hilkiah, and will clothe him with your robe and bind your sash on him. I will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open, and no one shall shut. He shall shut, and no one shall open.
Yep.
That, I was like, wait a minute.
It's pretty much the same.
And you know what's funny is I did the NRSV, but if you actually read, I'm pretty sure the NIV.
It says, what he shall open, no one shall shut.
Yeah.
And what he shall shut, no one shall open.
Yes.
Yeah. So, important things to explain here. Who is Eliakim? So, this verse comes from a passage talking about the current prime minister, so to speak, of Israel. Mm-hmm. So, Israel has a king. We kind of talked about that last time. When the king has a prime minister who does stuff on his behalf. And especially when the king is gone or incapacitated or held captive or whatever, the prime minister sort of holds the keys to the kingdom. He can run the kingdom in the absence of the king. That's typically what he did.
Yeah,
it becomes interesting to think
about.
about.
Very interesting.
So I think it was Shebna, if you look at the full passage. It didn't matter. Whoever it was gets kicked out because God's like, you stink at this. And so he puts Eliakim in there and says exactly what the prime minister does. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David, which is the kingdom. And I thought
that was a very because not only was that
keys is a symbol of authority.
Well, no, but the house of David.
Yeah.
And then if you
interesting. Because Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. Yeah.
The house of David.
Right. So there's the keys as a symbol of authority of the house of David. And what he opens, no one should shut. What he shuts, no one should open. Yeah. So he gets to make binding decisions as the prime minister of David's magisterium.
Yeah. So
David's
now you have Jesus, who is the king.
Yeah.
The new king of
the new kingdom. Yeah.
The new kingdom, descendant of David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, king of the Davidic kingdom too. Yeah.
Yeah. Who not only, so when I say this is like, to me, it's like, how do you not say these two together? Because he's the kingdom of David, he's the king. And here he is saying, hey, when I am gone, here's the key. Because I am leaving, you are pretty much in charge. Yeah. Because like you said, prime minister.
Yeah. And this is the important verse, right? So it's like, why is this the Jewish root to the papacy? Well, this verse is a good example of why there are Jewish roots behind what Jesus is doing with Peter in Matthew 16. Because exactly what you said. The Davidic household had a prime minister who, when the king was incapacitated or gone, we see right here, gets to make binding decisions for the kingdom. They get to act as if they are the king themselves.
Until the
king comes back. Right. So then we see Peter. And Peter, who was named Peter by Jesus, gets told, I'm giving you the keys. What you bind and loose, no one can unbind and unloose, etc. And then the next thing I told you, after that, well, Matthew 18, but immediately after the parts of Matthew 16 we read, Jesus tells them he's going to die and go away. And Peter says no. And he says, what do you mean no? Get behind me, Satan.
Yes.
He tells him he's going to leave.
Meaning...
Yeah.
You're in charge.
I think so. And then, so an important caveat is that with the binding and loosing portion, Orthodox Christians will reference Matthew 18, which we talked about last episode, where he gives all of the apostles the ability to make binding and to bind and loose, which is akin to the judges of Israel, which we talked about that authority and the Jewish roots of how Moses ordained the 70, and there was always one in the seat of Moses, and then there was the 70, and they all shared that authority to bind and loose. So all of the apostles can bind and loose collectively, and then individually in their regions. That's true, according to Matthew 18. The Orthodox are correct in that. What's different is no mention of keys in Matthew 18. So Peter gets keys and binding and loosing, both. And the keys are a symbol of Davidic kingdom authority of being a prime minister. So Peter is, as an apostle, sharing in what they get in Matthew 18, and even the binding and loosing here. Sure, you could say those are the same. But the keys, he's given the keys, and that's not insignificant. And I've never heard someone explain that without collapsing them into the same way to try to explain around it.
See, actually, you know how I've noticed people explain it? They just leave everything out.
Just don't.
No, so this is literally what they'll say is, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. And so they make it a generalized verse for everyone. They leave out the part where I give you the keys, or they'll even put in that I give you the keys of the kingdom, but they'll leave out the part where it's saying, Peter, I'm talking to you. It's like because I've noticed this. Because when I was going and researching and doing this, I noticed a lot of, I don't know what denomination, but they would read that quote from Jesus, but they would not put the part right before it where it says, Peter, you. Like, it's just, I will give you the keys. So it's like a generalized, here you go, everybody. You can do all this. And so there's like, oh, what are we supposed to loose and bound?
Right.
It's like, well, if you read it in context, it's not too...
Because the loosing and binding is explicitly rabbinical.
Yeah.
If you know the Jewish roots of this. We read that and we're like, oh, yeah, we get to make decisions for our churches. Like, I vote on the potluck meetings. No.
Well, okay.
This is rabbinical.
So, what I think... So, to kind of go on a little tangent of, like, when you go from... Like, I'm in a Protestant church, and there's nothing... Like, I like my church. There's, it's whatever. But to sit there and go, well, no one has authority. And to actually sit here and say, well, no one has authority, and then come to find out, well, they have elders. Those elders get to dictate what the pastor talks about. And those elders actually have someone else that they have to go and get information from, depending on what kind of church it is. Like, if you're a part of a bigger church, like, your elders are in charge of your church, and they have to go to the, I don't know, central
convention,
church, whatever it is, and then they have to discuss there. So it's like, we say there's no authority, yet every church has an authority structure, but who dictates that top person gets to have it. Right. And I didn't know that until I started working for a church. I'm like, oh, wait, you guys have to actually listen to somebody else. You can't just talk about whatever you want. So maybe there is a reason Isaiah 22 never gets brought up, is because they don't want it to be brought up.
Could be.
Or
I think most people just don't know it exists.
Or maybe they don't know it exists.
That's what I think. But I didn't know it existed for a long time.
I didn't know either. I just thought it was interesting to be like, everyone says, well, there's no authority. Like, there's no one in charge of who gets to dictate what scripture means and what this is and what that is. But yet, they have people who tell them.
Yeah, what's interesting to that for me was when I was involved in a lot of different churches, but I was particularly involved. We talked about my testimony. There was a church in Phoenix called Antioch that I was involved in. And at that church, and I'm not saying that they were the only one like this. There's just this specific church I'm talking about. But there were many churches I've been in, same way. That there was a head plant, like a head church that got started by the guy who founded it and planted it. And he got he got ordained from, whatever denomination, and then they told him to go start his own or whatever.
University of Phoenix Online.
Yeah. That's funny. Anyways, planted a church, and that church grew, and they went and planted other churches in the same structure, organizational structure. So there's Antioch, Waco, where it was founded, and they planted Antiochs all over the place. And that's different than like sending someone to plant an autonomous church like he did, right? These are churches directly under him. And the Harvest Bible Chapel, same way. Mars Hill, when that was a thing, same way.
So technically he has authority over
I was going to say,
church.
We would have said, oh, we believe in the Bible alone, and whatever the Bible says we believe. But whenever there were questions about the Bible, because let's be honest, it's not like it's easy to read. Like, I'm sorry, the Bible, plain to read, easy to understand in matter of faith and morals? Clearly not. Like, let's just level with each other. We have a hard time with this book, if for nothing else, we're 2,000 years removed from the culture, not to mention the geography and language differences, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just be honest. The Bible's hard to understand. Okay, we come to a passage in our particular church where we believe Bible alone, and we have trouble interpreting it.
Mm-hmm.
The most common answer I heard is, well, what I've heard so-and-so say, talking about the person that planted the church.
Mm-hmm.
People have a natural desire for authority, and I don't.
Yeah,
and
whether
I don't,
we want to admit
whether we
it
want it or not, no matter how anti-authoritarian
Mm-hmm.
we are, people are sheep. That's why the Bible calls us sheep. We not just want, but we almost like need someone to follow that we can trust. Hey, it's supposed to be Jesus, by the way, and everything he does. So that's what it's supposed to be. But that always blew my mind because I was like, wait a minute. You are relying on a living authority for your view of the Bible.
And you're relying on him to be right.
Right. And what's funny is that when I was there in particular in the D school, they literally had a segment talking about spiritual authority. And one of the examples they talked about was how King David had to submit himself to the prophet Samuel and then to Nathaniel. And so there was this reality of spiritual authority over David's life. There was this reality. That's my baby crying, if you guys can hear that in the background. There's this reality of spiritual authority in the lives of the Old Testament and even in the New. Paul calls himself the spiritual authority of the Corinthian church. They literally told us the people that are your pastors are your spiritual authority, and God, to be obedient to God, you need to submit to them. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was interesting because when I was hearing those, I was like, so if there's a spiritual authority, why is it you?
Yeah.
And so all of this stuff we're talking about kind of goes to that.
That's kind of one of my big things is after reading all this, I'm like, who do we trust is right? Mm-hmm. And I say this with all respect to all 30,000 denominations.
I'm sorry. I'm mean.
We all disagree on important stuff.
Yeah, it's not trivial. And like this is another thing when I was Protestant, people are like, oh, well, it's not a matter of salvation. I'm like, I'm sorry, but having a different view of the modus of salvation in terms of election is a matter of salvation because we're literally making a claim that God saves people in different ways, like Calvinist versus Arminian, that whole debate. They're like, well, it's not a matter of salvation. Like if you believe something wrong about that, it's not like you're not saved. But the discussion of the thing itself is about salvation. Mm-hmm. So like, yeah, it's important.
Yeah.
It's not trivial. I agree.
Yeah, so that was kind of a big why I want to, and I actually want to talk to more people, like other pastors and actually understand, because what this opened up for me was I don't even know what my church believes. Mm-hmm. Because we don't actually talk about, we talk about stuff day to day, like once a week we come in and talk about certain things, but I don't even actually know what they believe about baptism, communion, actually believe. And that's huge, because actually I know one of the church that I went to when I got baptized in it, the guy goes, I'm not going to say the church, but the guy goes, just so you know, I want to make sure you understand, this doesn't mean you're saved. And at the time I was like,
what am I doing then?
Well, at the time I'm like, yeah, I know, this is just me confessing that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and I didn't think of anything. Right. And then I'm sitting here then why get baptized? Why am I doing this? And to me, I'm like, you know what? Well, I don't care what you said. It was. It was to be saved. And so I don't know, I disagree with my church. I'm like, I got baptized because I'm pretty sure, I feel like Jesus wants me to be baptized. That's a whole nother discussion, but that was just, I don't know what
baptism episode.
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't even know what my church believes. I don't know if I'm taking communion. Am I taking communion right? Do I even agree with what they think communion is? Who do I believe or trust? Whenever I chose a church, it did come down to who did I like speaking. Yeah. So it was an authority structure of I just trust them to teach me right.
I have a whole idea for an episode on authority that pans down to this, that the central issue is authority of all these debates.
Because it always comes back to, well, what did so-and-so say? Right. It's never
well, here's what the Bible says.
Here's what
well, here's how I read the Bible.
This is in kind of to what you said. It's well, this is what he said. And I'm like, oh, this is what my pastor said this weekend. This
Right.
is what, and I'm like, well, I had multiple pastors. Well, I don't really care for this pastor, but this pastor I really like.
Right.
So then all of a sudden, that's a whole nother discussion. But all of a sudden, you're only going to church every other week because you don't want to hear one of them talk.
Right. You don't like one of the pastors.
So,
yeah,
and not sorry to get a little off tangent, but like, but it comes back to this whole, like, who do you trust?
Mm-hmm.
And if the Bible is establishing some sort of authority, because from my understanding, that's what Acts and Colossians and all the letters afterwards are about, is not only an establishment of stuff, but showing how there are churches at the time not following what they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And he's like, you will meet many false teachers. Stop doing what they're doing. Do what we have taught you. And it's kind of the same concept of, well, now we have many, like, how do we trust who we're listening to? How do we trust to interpret the Bible correctly? Is there an authority structure? Now we see that even in the Old Testament, we have where they place someone in charge of the kingdom.
And that's not to mention everything we talked about last episode.
Yeah,
of
and that's
the priestly authority, of the Mosaic seat, all of those things.
Yeah, and how, Jesus says, trust or listen to them because they are seated in the seat of Moses.
Yeah, Matthew 23.
So it's like, these are important little, like, nothing he says is unimportant.
Well, and I think it's an interesting continuity problem. So for the Protestant Christian, this poses a problem, because if you read the Old Testament with any semblance of just plain reading and any semblance of integrity, you have to admit what we talked about last episode, at least to a degree. Maybe you disagree with me on how fully I took that argument, but Moses and the judges had the ability to make binding decisions on the people based on the law and the oral traditions. They had that authority. Anyone that reads the Old Testament can find that.
Well, did we talk about that in Acts?
Yeah, Acts chapter 2.
About circumcision, and did we talk about that? I can't remember.
Oh, Acts 15, we did not. We should talk about that. Ooh.
Can we just gloss over that real quick? Just like,
oh man, it's so good.
Big. So maybe we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that because I want to talk about church fathers, ecumenical councils.
Okay, so
yeah, Acts 15.
But I think that's an important to the authority, to the Jewish roots.
Well, what I was trying to say is, in the Old Testament, there was a very clear judicial, religious, and magisterial authority that the people had to obey on matters not just of like law of the land, but on religion and doctrine and morals. And they got to make binding decisions in moments when the original codified Torah didn't necessarily fit. And Jesus testifies that. Okay, why then is what Jesus does so radically different if, some of the Protestant views of authority are correct? If that's what God established, permitted, sustained, and then testified to in Matthew 23, the established means of authority of the seat of Moses and the elders, the priests, the prophets, and the kings, all of those creating the written word, the oral tradition, and then the living voice of authority making binding decisions. If that was not just established by God, but sustained by God, and then affirmed by God himself in Matthew 23, why is what he does in the new covenant supposedly so radically different?
It
doesn't make
when
sense.
You say that, it's completely different. Like, if you completely get rid of that structure, you've changed the entire religion.
And so I know some people that I've talked to would be like, well, because now we have the Holy Spirit.
But we also have 30,000 denominations that all disagree on things.
That's kind of the thing is not to be like too harsh-handed.
But that's
right. Well, and where they get that from, by the way, is there's a verse in John, I think it's John 14. Let me find it, where they're like, well, Jesus says in the Gospel of John that the Spirit will lead us to all truth, and it's not said to everybody. Again, just like this, I think it's actually John 16. I'm sorry. That verse is not said to everybody. It's said to the disciples. Oh my gosh, now I can't find it. But it's in there somewhere.
We swear. Yeah. Trust us. Oh yeah, trust us. No, so I actually had an analogy to all this. So we have.
Oh, here it is. You found it? Yeah, John 16. I have much more to say to you, John 12. So John 14 through 16, Jesus gives this long discourse at the Last Supper where he institutes the Eucharist. Just going to slide that in there. He gives this long discourse about what's going to happen to them. And if you read all the Gospels, he says a bunch of crazy stuff. Towards the end of it in John's Gospel, he says, I have much more to say to you than you can now bear. He's already said a lot. And then he says, but when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. He will not speak on his own. He'll speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. So I've heard people literally say to that problem I just posed, the continuity error, if there was this really clear established authority in the Old Testament to make those decisions that God created, sustained, and then testifies to in the New Testament, where did it go? They say, oh, well, the Spirit leads us in all truth. This is said to the apostles, and just the apostles. And then when we flip into the book of Acts, we don't see everyone that happens to come to Christ being led into all truth on their own, just in their closets reading their Bibles. They submit themselves to the apostles' teaching.
What Bible?
Well, they don't have a New Testament for sure. They would have had an Old Testament, but
would
yeah.
They? Yeah. Everyone had their own Old Testament?
No. Yeah, because the scrolls thing.
Yeah.
The different synagogues, different churches didn't have every
We didn't
scroll.
have this thing
Right.
to trust.
Right.
So
I think that's an important thing to think about, because like we said last episode, Jesus Christ is the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. That's Hebrews 8, I think. If he did it this way then, why is it so radically different now?
Well, so I had an analogy to all of this is, so in America, if you're not listening to us from America, we have this thing called a constitution. I would say the Constitution is the closest thing to a Bible.
The Bible of America.
The Bible of America. Right. Sure. And so if you ask someone today about the Constitution, they would say it needs to be interpreted. Mm-hmm. And see, to me, there's a problem with that is the people who wrote it did not intend for it to be interpreted. It was intended how they wrote it. It was for the time. This is my argument.
Okay. I think I'm tracking with you. No,
okay.
No, keep going.
This is my argument. So they wrote it how they wrote it for multiple reasons. There are outside sources that will actually show that they wrote it a certain way and prove their points, just like how the Bible is not just the Bible.
Right. So you're not saying interpret it anew. You mean interpret it how they meant
this is how it was meant to be read.
Right. No, I agree.
When I say interpret, I mean we today go, well, what they really meant,
or what they should mean.
And so and so to me, like, we have a Supreme Court who is supposed to interpret the Constitution. When I say interpret, they're supposed to read it how it was meant to be written. Sure. And obviously things have changed. So yes, you have to, kind of like what you were kind of alluding to earlier, is there's nothing in the Bible about technology. So someone has to dictate, well, is this okay or is this not okay? So here we have the Constitution.
The Supreme Court is the ones that do that.
The Supreme
Court living
Court
voice of interpretive authority.
But the problem we have is they are elected.
Appointed.
Or sorry, they are appointed.
We don't elect them. We don't even elect them.
No, they are appointed by someone.
Yeah.
And some of them don't have credentials. Some of them do. Some go in there because they were appointed to read it the way that someone else told them to read it.
Yeah, there's like an agenda behind it, sure.
And whether you're left, right, doesn't matter.
Happens both ways.
It happens both ways. But my point is, this document was written a certain way,
with certain intended
sure. And you can go back and actually find documents to collaborate with it. But we've gone to the point where, because they are appointed, not by a God figure, but we consider a God figure, they get to dictate what it is.
Right.
And so
they can change that.
They can change the meaning.
Right.
So when my analogy is, so we have this Bible where, if we want to, not being Catholic, but that was 200 years for a constitution that's already been torn apart, said, well, that's not what they meant. This is what they meant. Now you go 2,000 years. We have a Bible that needs to be read a certain way. And for so long it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have so many disagreements.
Right.
And like, I guess to me, I don't know where I'm going with it, but...
Well, I think the Supreme Court analogy works. And I think, well, you're talking about two different methods of interpretation, right? One is like the originalist reading. Like, here's what they originally meant by that.
Yes.
And then the another one is here's what it needs to mean for our time.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the authority structure of the church, the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Is there's the text and there's the magisterial interpretive authority. And I can tell you this, if you look at the doctrines of the church, they're always going, this is what it originally meant. This is what the apostles taught.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the bend they have, right? And that is important for exactly what you said, because we can read it all day and be like, well, they didn't know about this yet, and so then this changes that, so we have to just forget about it because it was a different time. Mm-hmm. Or, well, we disagree with that because of this, and really it needs to say this because our time is different. It's like, well, in terms of like making a binding decision on something that's just not mentioned in the Bible, that's one thing. But if the Bible explicitly says X and now you want to do Y, so you just interpret it this way, that's a problem. And that's the thing is, the text just clearly isn't plain enough to where you can read it and go, that person's wrong. Yeah. Because it happens all the time. And who do we trust? We trust the person that we have deemed the authoritative interpreter of the text.
That was kind of my point. And it's like, we trust the Supreme Court. Or we don't necessarily trust it, but we have entrusted them to interpret it correctly.
Yeah, just like you might entrust your pastor to interpret the Bible correctly.
But sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. But to actually even go back on that is what's kind of funny about the structure of the Supreme Court and the Constitution is for a group of people that were kind of scattered on religion and some of them were, this and some were that. Not all were Catholic. Some were Protestant. Some were whatever. They somehow managed to create a authoritative structure very similar to the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Like the 12 jurors, 12 apostles.
Well, and that came from way back. But I just think it's funny that these people
interpretive authority
they disagreed on. Yep. Maybe they didn't like the Pope, and maybe they didn't like that, but somehow they still developed a system.
All legal systems at some point are similar to that.
I know, it's just funny to you don't like authority yet. Right. You develop an authority system that is very
papist,
very close to structured the
How
same.
How dare they? Yeah, it's interesting. All that stuff is really interesting. I think that's a good analogy, and I think that's the dilemma, because for me, a long time as a Protestant, I was like, well, the Bible's true. We just have to learn how to read it correctly. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's what studying was about. And the beautiful part about scholarship today, with the advent of people like we talked about last time, like N.T. Wright, Brant Petrie, all those, just on a academic level, we're starting to read the Bible in that context, and it's changing things. It's changing how we view. So that is starting to work in the sense that, in terms of how I think the Bible should be read, right? Yeah. Who gives me the authority? It's becoming closer to what the first Christians believed it to mean. Yeah. And as far as I'm concerned, if between listening to a first century AD Christian and someone in the 19th or 20th or 21st century who's closer to what Jesus taught, I think I'm going to go with the person closer in proximity, geography, and culture than the person who is not in the same time, not in the same culture, not in the same language, and not even really coming from the same worldview necessarily all the time. So all of that's, we're just going off on tangents all over the place. Yeah. But that kind of almost goes into what I want to talk about with authority in general, that this is the question behind every question of Catholicism or Protestantism or Orthodoxy, is who is the authority? What is the nature of the authority Jesus established in his church? Who did he give it to? How does it pass on? How do we know that they have that authority? Mm-hmm. And like when I was Protestant, how do I know that God called this pastor to be a pastor? Because I know for sure that pastor just did it for the money. Mm-hmm. And this guy's not making money. Okay, so he didn't do it for the money. But how do I know God called him? What system is there in place? Is there a normative means that authority is transmitted from one place to another, that we can trace, that we can look at, that we can verify with history? Yeah. In my experience with my Protestant churches, no. When I was Anglican, yes, asterisk, big asterisk. Catholicism and Orthodoxy, absolutely. That's the idea of apostolic succession. that this bishop laid his hands on and ordained this bishop. And it goes all the way back to the apostles, which, by the way, is exactly what we talked about last episode with the rabbis, with the judges of Israel who had Samika, the laying on of hands, going all the way back to Moses. Which is easier to verify? That they have this system of transmitting the truth that isn't just the truth itself, but there's a means by which it's transmitted. There's a form that it carries in how we can know that not only do you have the truth, but you've been appointed to have the truth. Well, Catholicism claims that. Other churches don't. And Protestantism is a mixed bag, because like Anglicanism would claim apostolic succession. Lutherans are trying to kind of get it by getting co-ordained with Anglicans now, but they would have claimed just the succession of the truth through, other churches just don't care at all. They're like, well, my elders ordained me, but they don't need to go all the way back to the apostles. God called them now, Yeah. But it just doesn't work, because how can I know beyond a reasonable doubt that he did? So.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll push back on it a little, and like,
sure.
I don't know. I'm not going to talk for God. Like, maybe God did call them to something. And like, to me, there's nothing wrong. Like, I'm going to say, okay, no, let me phrase this correctly. To me, there is good in these churches.
Oh yeah, I'm not meaning to say that there's not.
No, and so like when maybe God did call them to something, and because at one point I thought God was calling me to be a pastor.
Me too.
And no, sure. I don't think, and to discern it was, I think I just wanted to do it. And because I was like, oh, this was so cool for me. Like, I want to go do that and maybe somebody will.
Right.
And so I got to discern that and be like, okay, maybe not. And then all of a sudden, here I am going down this weird rabbit hole of stuff. But to say all that, but to me, there's still like a good for, because of it, I wouldn't have just become Catholic.
Yeah,
so,
me either.
To be atheist, to become Christian.
Sure.
Like, there would never be a thing that happened that made me go, oh, Catholicism, let's look into it. No, never, not one bit. So, like,
no, I agree with you.
I'm like, at least it got me into church. At least it got me into learning about God. Like, all of a sudden, I believed in this thing I never believed in before, and it was great. And actually, it's helped me and my family out so much. And so I feel like there is a place
I think that's true.
for it.
No, I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of stuff happening that's good.
Yeah.
I think my main point was that is God calling them to be the interpretive authority.
Well, and that's my thing is I don't necessarily always agree with what they say.
Right.
And the more I'm growing for my journey, the more, like, at first it was about me. Okay. To be honest. It was God got me in the seat. God got me there. He made me like, oh, I feel good. I had that feel good feeling. But then all of a sudden I'm starting to read more and I'm like, okay, maybe I don't do this for me anymore. I feel like God asked me to do something for him. So now my mindset's changed. So that's where now I'm starting to look into stuff. And that's where, I've been going to mass, and like but I also have been still going to the Protestant church. I say Protestant because I don't know what denomination, if we are any.
Foursquare?
Foursquare, but I don't know what that is.
It's kind of charismatic, kind of.
So, I go to both, and like I've been checking out other churches, and I go not for me in the sense of like I want to learn, but I'm trying to go because I feel like God is asking me to give him a day. It's not about me going to get a feeling anymore. It's about me going to spend time with God for a day, just a sacrifice of something. At least I could do that. And I still fail at that. Like I go for an hour, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure he wants more than an hour of my time. But the whole, like, it got me there. It got me into this. I still think there's good in it. But for me, now there's a shift of importance. It's more of a loyalty of like, hey God, it's not about me, it's about you. What do you want me to do? What do you need me to do? Are these things actually important to you? Because I can go, well, they're not that important. But what if God's going, well, they're really important. Here you are. You're so close. And it's like, so like to shift my mind on things. of this whole thing. So it's like, but like I can still look back and appreciate the way I got to where I'm at.
Yeah, that's important.
But I can also see the growth and like now I want to learn more about God, and I want to actually maybe there is more to this than just a feeling.
Right.
And so that's where like, okay, maybe there is an authoritative structure to this, and maybe the Pope is actually important. Maybe God did establish something. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to talk more anyways because I didn't really talk the last one. But yeah, it's just like this whole like maybe there is more to this than just a feeling and reading the Bible. I've learned more not reading the Bible than reading about the Bible than reading the Bible, because all of a sudden now reading about the Bible and actually getting verses and actually getting comparisons and all that has actually showed me the Bible in such a different light and I wouldn't have gotten there just by reading the Bible.
Yeah, you would have been confused.
Well, I never would have put the two and two together, because when would I read Isaiah and then jump straight to Matthew? I wouldn't. I'd probably read Isaiah, go to the next book in the Old Testament, whichever order it was. I would never remember this as important.
Yeah, the cross references are huge. Yeah.
So it's like, it's interesting to actually look at that. And then to kind of go back to Mass, how they read Scripture, from my understanding, from what it is, they read something Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel, but they all kind of go together.
They all are either directly related in terms of their themes, or in a way they're related. Yeah, there's always a reason they're paired together.
So I thought that was kind of cool. I don't really learn much in Mass, but I've learned everything outside of it. But it was just kind of like, I want to talk about this authority because I feel like that's such an important thing, and being taught like we all have authority. And I'm like, should I have authority over some things? And I'm
Probably
like,
not.
Probably not. So I'm like, I don't know about that. So it's just been that's been kind of a journey of like, oh, and then to actually see it in the Bible. And then, and to study that, it's been like, okay, maybe there is more to it. And like, I still have problems with Catholicism and the Pope and everything.
We should have an episode on Stephen's problems.
And I mean, it might get a little R-rated, but I have problems, and I'm not the only one.
Sure.
And that's, it's like, but being able to talk about it, I think is more beneficial, because again, nobody wants to talk. Everyone just hates it. And it's like, well,
yeah, I know.
There's so much,
true.
there's so much truth into it. And like, you said you wanted to learn, I can't remember what you just said it, like you wanted to learn all this stuff about like
Judaism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like I wanted to learn Judaism. That's what started me like really like wanting to know more. Is I was like, oh, I need to know Jesus. I need to look at Judaism. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute.
Why does this sound like the Pope?
Yeah. What is this? What is that? So it's pretty cool. But yeah, that's kind of just my little thing of authority and why I wanted to talk about it. It's like, because I think it's a big deal. I think we've changed.
Yeah, we've lost sight of a lot of those Jewish roots things. Again, this is just kind of like an initial.
We have, but someone hasn't.
The Catholic Church hasn't.
Yeah, and I mean, even the Orthodox.
They might not
Church,
have even.
We didn't even get to talk really about the Orthodox.
Yeah,
Church.
that should be a whole episode on its own.
Yeah,
because
they still do the same stuff.
Yes.
It's just the Pope.
Yes,
it's that authority, but it's like they still follow it. Anglicans to a point still follow stuff. Lutherans, like, just little things got taken out.
And maybe sometimes big things.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying, like, the further removed from Judaism, I won't even say Catholicism, the further you get removed from Judaism, Christianity does not look like Judaism.
Right. Or even like early Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a huge point. Like, it's funny. There's actually a book written by Jefferson Bethke, if you know who that is. He wrote this poem called "Why I Hate Religion But Love Jesus." It was like this viral poem, and then he wrote a book about it, and then he became kind of popular. And I followed this guy for a while because I was like, that poem is dope. And he wrote a book called "It's Not What You Think," and he's kind of going on this journey. He's not Catholic or anything yet, yet. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know where he's at on that. I don't think so. But he's on this whole N.T. Wright re-Judaizing the New Testament journey. And in his book, It's Not What You Think, he mentioned this. He said this. He said, how much has to change in our daily belief, in our daily practice, and I'm paraphrasing, before what we're doing and what the people who wrote the book did is a different religion. Mm-hmm. How many things have to change? And I think that was a big thing. Like, that sentence, I wasn't like even investigating Catholicism when I first read that, but I was like, dang. Because what I knew about Judaism and what I knew about its impacts, just understanding what Judaism was and then reading the New Testament, it changed everything for me about being a Christian. Mm-hmm. And none of the things it called me to do made sense in the context I was in until I at the very least, was Anglican. Because that was more traditional. It was rooted in those practices, those liturgies, those rituals. And again, that's a whole episode of why religion isn't bad, you know? But the authority behind all of it was ultimately the big thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like who has the authority to change or not change those things? What can be changed? Who gets to make that decision? And it can't just be, well, the Holy Spirit told me. I believe the Spirit tells us powerful things, but like how 30,000 people have said the Holy Spirit led me to start a church that was different than what everyone else did. They can't all be right. It's just a matter of logic, right? So that's kind of the Wars
were started.
Yeah, literally, people killed, burned,
God
hanged,
told me
drowned.
This was supposed to be my land.
Yep. Yeah. So we're a little bit over. We went on just like an authority discussion in general, but just to kind of give you some key highlights. If you look at Matthew 16, Jesus, who named Peter Cephas, which he's Simon, becomes the rock, tells him he's the rock on which the church is going to be built, and gives him the keys of the kingdom. What were you going to say?
Dwayne the Rock.
He's Simon the Rock Johnson. Bar-Jonah. Simon the Rock Bar-Jonah.
Who knew the rock was related to
Jesus
Peter?
gives Peter the keys, the ability to bind and loose, and there's a direct parallel between what he says and how he says it to Peter and the Prime Minister of Israel. So the Jewish roots of the papacy are that when the king is gone, when the king is away, when Jesus ascends into heaven, the Prime Minister holds the keys until he gets back. So that's kind of the Jewish roots of the papacy in that idea. Other things to explore, like what we talked about last week, if you compare the narratives of Peter in Acts 2 to Moses in Exodus 24 through the whole Sinai narratives, and Peter in Acts 5 to Joshua, I think in Acts 6 or 7 with the sin of Achan, you'll see that the New Testament puts Peter in the place of Moses and Joshua in the book of Acts, which means that he's carrying the office of the ultimate judge of Israel in the new covenant, but that's an office that gets passed down. And if he's Moses and Joshua, his office would pass down as well. So that there's a whole discussion to be had on the succession of the papacy, how we can know that the office did that. That's going to be more in like the early church type of stuff. But yeah, that's it. If you want a lot more content on this, look up Swansona. He has a ton of content on the Jewish roots of the papacy. Brant Petrie has some really good lectures on it as well. But ultimately, again, if we don't understand who Jesus was as the Messiah, as the Jewish Messiah, if we don't understand what their culture thought about the Messiah, what they thought about their own religion, and we don't realize that the New Testament was written into that context, we're going to miss all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's why we do miss all of that stuff. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on the matter, I suppose. Any last thoughts from you?
Nothing good.
Nothing good? Yeah. There's nothing good going on.
Dwayne the Rock Johnson.
Dwayne the Rock. All right, well, I'm Drew the Catholic. Wow. I'm Drew the Catholic. Thanks for watching. It's a long episode, and I don't have water. I just had whiskey, so my throat's kind of getting dry.
He's been drinking, so
I've been drinking.
That's where he's all, and I'm like water, so I'm just mild over
I had to drink a whiskey to put up with this. So if you like this podcast, thanks for watching. Thanks for your support. We just ask that you like, subscribe, and share wherever you're listening or watching. That just kind of helps us get it out there. Yep. If you have someone that would benefit from listening to it, feel free to send it their way.
Share it to them. Also, if you like the content and you have any questions, we would love to
drop a comment.
Answer those. Maybe we'll do a question if we ever get to the extent where
if anyone
we have
watches
questions,
this besides our moms.
Yeah.
Hi, Mom. And my wife.
If we ever get enough questions, maybe we'll do a questions answer episode, or maybe just if there's something that relates to what we're on our topic, we'll answer it, or he'll answer it. I'll have something stupid to say with it.
Yeah. So, and some other cool stuff we're going to be doing. We're not just going to be having episodes where Steven and I pick a Catholic-ish topic and discuss it. That's going to be a lot of them, but we also want to bring other people onto the show. So I have friends that are Catholic, friends that are converting to Catholicism, friends that are like, rockstar Catholics, and then friends that are not Catholic that have questions about it. And we want to start bringing some of those people on. I want to do a segment where basically people that aren't Catholic, that are Protestant or whatever they are, that have questions or problems or issues, we bring them on and kind of talk through those as well. So those are some of my ideas for future episodes.
Yeah, and also to some future episodes, so we're not just always on Catholicism alone.
We'll be talking about culture through
a Catholic lens, even a Christian lens of certain aspects of our day-to-day lives. So.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Drew the Catholic.